Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 47. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today's podcast, we're going to look at the evolution of my podcast over nearly a year now and some new directions that we would want to go to. So it'll be a little bit shorter podcast today, and uh, what we'll do is we'll review the history of this podcast. We started off interviews only. If you haven't watched from the beginning, that's the way it was. And now it's almost exclusively been solo podcast where I just will talk about a subject. And I want to talk a little bit about what we want to do in the near future. So I'm if you're watching on YouTube, then you can see that I'm on my YouTube studio just to kind of show some of the videos on my channel. And I was doing some business and entrepreneurship related stuff shortly before I started the podcast. And then last year I was at a conference in Tampa, Florida, and was talking to different people, and I realized one of the things that I could do is start a podcast. And my background as a robotics engineer, coupled with me being a Christian, of course, there's an intersection there that I think would make for interesting conversations. And so I wanted to look at that intersection between science and faith. Those are often viewed as mutually exclusive. And one of the things I wanted to show is that that's not the case at all. And I've certainly learned a lot since then. So my very first episode was with Moise DeRozier, who I met there in Tampa, Florida, and he is in the field of education. So he it helps with developing curricula for high school students, I believe, in the area of Florida. And so I had an interview with him. And then after that, Amos Tarfa, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, he is also into education. So very early on, many of the interviews that I was doing, first of all, I was only doing interviews with people. I didn't want to talk by myself on a podcast, felt uncomfortable with that, and just would do interviews with people. Those interviews would be with just about anybody who wanted to discuss an intersection of anything with faith. It didn't have to be necessarily strictly like hardcore research science or anything like that. And so the conversations with Moise and Amos went into a variety of topics. There was a former classmate in college that I interviewed next, who was a counselor, Eric Fisher, and I guess we have to go to the next page, but that was an interesting conversation. He talked about martial arts, among other things. And so then the next several podcasts were similar, where I was talking to people generally of faith, people who were believers, who talked about how their faith intersected with what they did, whether it was in education. In the case of Christopher Lind, he was with a company. He talked a lot about his background growing up around a morgue or a funeral home, I believe. And so that was an interesting conversation. There was a habit coach, Stephen Box, that we talked about things like losing weight, and he had an unconventional approach to that. And then in episode 6, I spoke with Dr. Bo Kirkwood. So he was a retired hospice care administrator and family physician, and he is an elder of a church in in the Texas area, I believe. And that was the first podcast where I really had a lot more comments and dislikes than likes. And this was an interesting change for me. Like if you look at previously, all of the stuff that I did, all of the videos that I posted were always people took them very well. But that episode was called "Evolution is Not Scientific at All," and it had quite a few between the audio version only and the video version. It had quite a few views compared to anything I'd previously done, quite a few comments, and a lot of dislikes. And I didn't know what to make of that, because I certainly didn't start the podcast to get a bunch of dislikes. We've certainly racked up plenty of them, and that will probably continue. And so I began to look at things like I did a series about monetization Mondays, because I was on this quest to get the YouTube channel monetized. I actually don't even care about that anymore at all. And so this is that was something I was doing, and I would begin to respond to these comments. And so I was responding to comments, and then when you look at my that people were disliking, even when I was responding to comments, I began to just simply embrace the negative part in not in terms of reading comments, because I soon had to stop doing that because it was just consuming too much of my time, and I was trying to answer people, and then I was finding myself answering the same comments repeatedly, and just having just again a lot of snarky comments, and I was beginning to have a negative attitude towards everything rather than focusing on just really trying to show truth, really trying to point out the error of something like evolution, for instance. And so there was quite a bit of that responding live to commenters that I started getting into. Again, interviewed Amos again in episode 7. He was in Cambridge, uh, doing some things there. We got to talk about that. And so I was still, that was the first, with Dr. Bo, that was the first podcast where we were really digging into something like evolution, digging into really what I was originally thinking about with the podcast, which is this intersection of faith and science and how we can reconcile the two. And so that episode, there was a lot of response to it, but again, because of the negativity, I wasn't really sure what to do with that. And so then uh, had some others like Amos and JR that I interviewed, and then I got to Dr. Don DeYoung, and his episode also did, well in terms of more views, but not very well in terms of a lot of several dislikes, where people were where there were comments and people were had some negative things to say. The name of that episode was "The Earth is Thousands, Not Billions of Years Old," and Dr. Don talked about the evidence for the world being created, not millions or billions of years ago, but a few thousand years ago. And so we talked about that. And I, again, began to answer more comments. And I even clipped up several pieces from our interview and posted that. Those did not do very well. And so then by the time I get to episode 10 of the podcast, so by this time we were in August, we began in June, I believe. By the time we got to August, I was interviewing Dr. Thomas Fanner, who is the leadership dad. So he kind of coaches dads in being better leaders. And I really wanted to pivot from kind of interviewing all different types of people to focusing a little bit more on the science aspect, which is what I originally was thinking about doing, but I didn't want to focus and just basically pigeonhole myself, or put myself into a corner, paint myself into a corner. But it became clear that out of those first 10 episodes, the Dr. Bo and the uh, Dr. Don episodes were those that really engaged a lot of people, and that there was a conversation, albeit a lot of negativity with it as well. So episode 11 is similar to this episode for today, where there was a pivot that was occurring, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it shortly before my birthday. And so in that episode, I talked about apologetics in general and said, I think I want to go in the direction of this being more of an apologetics podcast, where we look at the three major areas of, or really the first two major areas of what you would call traditional apologetics, and then not really look at the third area, which the first area is that there is a God, that and looking at the evidence for that and arguments in favor of that. The second area of apologetics is that the Bible is the Word of God, and looking at, again, extra biblical as well as intra biblical evidence for that. And so that was a big part of what I thought a lot about. And I had a new book coming out around that time. So I wanted to talk about a pivot for the podcast. So at that point, I wanted to really focus more on those kinds of science aspects that deal with the existence of God and the inspiration of the Bible. And so what happened is, immediately after that episode, I did another episode called The Genesis 1 Creation Days Were Literal 24-Hour Days. And this was my first podcast that went over 150 views, I guess, or something like that. And it, again, you can see that there are 78 comments on there. Some of those are my own, where I was going back and forth with people. But again, out of 6 total responses, 3 are likes and 3 are dislikes. So once again, there was a lot of negativity associated with that, where I was simply showing that yes, what we see in the scripture is that. And what happened is I had people who were believers who said that they believed in the Bible that said, well, that doesn't necessarily uh, just because Genesis 1, that might be your interpretation of Genesis 1, but that's not the way to interpret it. And this was somewhat surprising to me because, again, well, I found that there are plenty of people that say that they're believers that just don't actually believe the Genesis 1 account uh, at face value. And I don't think they would say this, but generally the reason for that is because of what they find outside of the Bible. And they want to reconcile the Bible with what they see outside of the Bible rather than the other way around. And like when we talk about faith science, it is important for us to understand that science is viewed through the lens of faith rather than the other way around. We on this podcast are not talking about viewing the Bible through the lens of science. And I think that's the difference. And so again, you're free obviously to do what you please, but here what we do is we view science through the lens of faith. And so someone might say, well, then that means your science is flawed or it's biased or something like that. But the truth is that everybody does this. Everybody has certain assumptions that they bring to the table. And so it's not that the person who believes in something like scientism, that science is the only way to learn something, they bring that belief to the table. So we all bring beliefs or assumptions to the table. And so the issue is I'm willing to say, hey, yes, these are the things that I'm bringing to the table when I'm doing science. And we would all do well to really examine what are the assumptions and the beliefs that you bring to the table. So, but that's a conversation for another day. Here, we that was the first episode that we saw that, and so I began to commit to doing more solo episodes. Although I really wasn't wanting to do only solo episodes, I was preferring to do interviews. But it became difficult to find science people to do these interviews with, and I'll talk a little bit about maybe why that is later. But I talked to Rob Renee, and he has a supplement company uh, called Exodus Strong, and so there was some interesting science related stuff in what we talked about. But although he's not a pure scientist in the or a researcher in the way that we were thinking about, there was a really interesting episode with James Brown, episode 14, where we looked at the prophecies in the book of Daniel and how they line up and how they are a proof of the Bible being inspired by God. Next, I had an episode about the Genesis 1 account being correct, that the earth was made before the sun. And that again, you can go and see that these my percentages of likes versus dislikes is just not very is not great there. But again, thankful for the engagement. So so I was beginning to get used to doing solo episodes and actually just being able to turn on the camera and talk about these various things that I'm coming across or various questions. So the next question I wanted to dig into was that if God exists, why is there pain, suffering, and evil in the world? And that was more of a Bible study, and that was an interesting one that got a lot of engagement as well. And again, in that case, you're seeing again very few likes there. So I began to realize that I was talking to one of my sisters about this, that it appears that I was attracting atheists to the channel, and that was not my original intention. I was just simply kind of talking about. We mentioned evolution with Dr. Bo, for instance, and we went into Age of the Earth, and and then talking about the Genesis accounts and why is there pain, evil, and suffering. I can imagine that that would be something that maybe an atheist might click on, but I wasn't really shooting for that audience. But it became clear that that was an audience that I was regularly attracting to the channel, and which is why the number of dislikes was higher than what I was used to. So I talked to Craig D. Hutt of Appian Media in episode 17. So that was late October or mid October of 2024. And let's see. Then then I had the interview with David Libby. Atheism is incompatible with science, and this was the first episode that, again, it's nearly at 400 views now. That was the first big episode where multiple hundred views in that first week, and of course, again, not well liked. and plenty of comments there. But we basically got into the philosophical underpinnings of atheism and how scientism and atheism, these kinds of things, atheism is incompatible with science in the sense that if you don't believe that there's a God, if you don't believe in a basis for science being repeatable and reliable, then it's very difficult to understand why, as an atheist, you would trust science at all because there's no reason to. By the way, David Libby has a new book out. He emailed me about it and I got a copy. His new book is called Apologize Without Apologizing, a philosophical defense of the biblical worldview, and it's pretty good book so far. And it really, chapter one by itself is a very interesting read to give you a sense of the philosophy behind how you can know a thing is something that we often don't think about. Again, as a trained engineer, that's my background. We didn't do a lot of philosophy of science and type stuff like that that someone like David Libby might talk about. So that's just chapter one alone is worth you checking out the book. And so I will probably that's a good opportunity for me to think about. So when it comes to I'm one of the things I would like to do in the future. Well, I guess I can go ahead and talk about this now. Is I would like to do some book reviews. I have an online bookstore, and that means I get to come in contact with a lot of books. Or I'll have someone like David Libby who will reach out and say, "Have a book coming out. If you'd like to check it out and leave a review, I would appreciate it." So I come across things like that, and because of that, it gives me an opportunity to kind of give you a sense of some of these books that I'm coming across and to give you my own personal thoughts or a review on it. So I think that's one of the things that I'll be doing in the coming episodes is we'll be doing book reviews. So for example, Apologize Without Apologizing, I'll probably do that, do a review on that one in the next few weeks. I've got a let's see, three other books here that I don't know that I'll do a review on this one, but there's an interesting book that I came across called What is Creation Science? There are people in the comments that often say that the name of my podcast, Faith Science, is contradictory. And of course, one of the things I point out is that there's a double meaning behind the term faith science. There's the sense that, as I've just mentioned just a few minutes ago, that all science is done with some kind of faith behind it. You might have a faith that there is no God. You might have a faith that everything is material, is matter, that there is nothing that is immaterial in the world. Again, that's a faith system, right? Everybody has faith behind their science. So the question is, what is the faith that you have behind your science? And so that's one aspect to what we mean there by faith science, that I bring my faith to my science just like everybody else does. But the other aspect to it is I like to think of the difference between real science and fake science as the difference between what I would call faith science and fake science. Faith science is science that you can put your trust in, science that you can put your faith in, and then fake science is not. And I think this is the difference between what Henry Morris would call creation science, something that you can trust in, versus something like evolution, which is something that doesn't help you to put your trust in. And it leads to faulty conclusions, it leads to bad lines of research. And that's one of the things that we're going to be pointing out increasingly in the coming episodes as well. And so in my estimation, evolution is fake science. It is science that is not real. It is again based on a lot of stories and a lot of conjecture. I was listening to someone talk today about how he was originally an evolutionist, and so this is someone who is not. He is would now be a proponent of what you would call intelligent design. And what he said is, he said, and he's probably in his 70s now. He said, I was in sitting in a class, and the professor was talking about, or the teacher was talking about evolution, and he was talking about the evolution of fish. And he said that, and at the time, this man he was a young man, he was an evolutionist, a very staunch evolutionist. He would debate different ministers and stuff. And he said, I was sitting in that class, and the teacher said that the scales of a fish moved down and turned into teeth. And he said, like, that was the evolutionary story that was given. And he said, I heard that. And I said, that can't be true. I believe in evolution, but you're telling me that the scales of the fish slowly moved down, and that's how teeth came into a fish. And that's just, and what I would say to you is that maybe there are stories that are more plausible than that, but they still aren't what happened and they still don't make sense. And but there are plenty of stories like the one that he told where even somebody who's an evolutionist says, uh I yeah, I don't think that is what happened. And when he looked into it, of course, there was no evidence for this. It was just a story. And so much of evolution is like that. It's fake science. And so this is part of why we bring attention to this, why we bring awareness to this and speak against it. So, a couple other books that we're going to be looking into. There's here's a book called The Darwin Effect that I will be reading by Dr. Jerry Bergman, and it basically, the subtitle is "Its Influence on Nazism, Eugenics, Racism, Communism, Capitalism, and Sexism." Of course, we're going to have an episode about racism. I don't know when, but I will get to it because it's a very interesting topic to look at the inherent, if you take evolution to its logical conclusion, you're going to get to racism. We see it in the X-Men stories, right? That there's this race of X-Men or of mutants versus the regular humans. So whenever you have something that's based on evolution, it's going to inherently separate out people that are closer to the animals and closer to the beasts, closer to the savages, is the way Darwin would have said it. It's going to inherently talk about people that are closer to the animals, which means they are less evolved or less enlightened, smart, whatever you want to say, than the mutated or the evolved. And so that's going to inherently separate people. Whereas what the Bible teaches is that we all came from one man and woman, Adam and Eve. And so there is no sense of me being better than you because my skin looks a little different or my hair grows a little differently or my eyes look or shaped or colored differently than yours. We all come from the same two people. And so this, the creation account gives us a sense of why mankind is unique, why mankind is special, because we are made in the image and likeness of God. So that is because mankind is made in the image of God, that is what makes us special. And so not because we're better than the animals, and that is true that we're better than the animals, but it's because God says so, and not because we're just evolved animals ourselves or social animals or these different things that people say. The other book that I'm really looking forward to reading and reviewing for you is The Faith of Christopher Hitchens by Larry Alex Taunton. And the subtitle there is The Restless Soul of the World's Most Notorious Atheist. I saw this book and thought this was really interesting. And I'm just going to read this quick summary on the back of the book. It says, at the time of his death, Christopher Hitchens was the most notorious atheist in the world. Yet while he raged against God on stage, he maintained meaningful, though largely hidden from public view, friendships with evangelical Christians such as Francis Collins, Douglas Wilson, and the author Larry Alex Taunton. For the first time, Taunton reveals his intimate conversations with Hitchens and the questions that followed a seemingly convinced atheist until the day he died. So this is a really interesting read, I think, that we'll talk about. And so we'll talk about the that book, The Faith of Christopher Hitchens, as one of those on the book list of one of the book reviews that we'll do. So I think that'll be an interesting one. So that'll be one, either a segment in certain podcasts, or I'll just do kind of an entire podcast where I review a book or maybe multiple books that I will have read recently. So that's another thing that I want to do in the future. So that's one thing that I do want to do that's a little bit differently than now, because I don't think I've even done a single episode like that yet, but we will do that in the future. So going back to around episode 19 and 20, we talked to Captain Kirk, who's out in California. He was more of a law guy and looked at the legal aspects of, I believe that's right. And he also did some education type stuff where he said there are questions that evolutionists can't answer. Um, and then I talked to an atheist, Mark Alsip, and Mark has a new book out that I haven't come across. I might read that book as well and review that. And it is about, let me look it up really quick. Um, it's about it talks about how fundamentalists are taking over America or something. Bound by Faith. That This is the name of it. So his first book is Journey to Reason. So I read his first book, Journey to Reason, and we talked about some of it on the podcast. I had just finished it right before shooting the podcast with him, and so we talked about his book. And I had some questions for him because it was really more, it was somewhat like a memoir, um, but he is someone who would consider himself a former uh, believer. And but he really, if you look at his childhood, the way he even describes it in the book, his parents were not really strong. They did not bring him up. They sent him often to churches and of various kinds, and so his teachers and those who were really teaching him didn't have great answers to the questions he would ask. And so this was something that irritated me because these were simple questions, and he was stumping people with really simple questions, which says a lot or doesn't speak well for the people that were teaching him. But this next book 2, is called Bound by Faith: The Fundamentalist Takeover of America. And he says he returns with a stark reminder: the threats he once cautioned about are no longer hypothetical; they are unfolding in real time. And so here's someone who is probably very much so not happy with whatever happened in the elections. I'm apolitical. I don't pay a whole lot of attention to it, but clearly some people care a whole lot. A lot of people cared very much about the elections from 2024 and took them to mean something really, really good or something really, really bad, depending on what side you were on. And so clearly his book was saying whatever happened was really, really bad. And so it'll be interesting to potentially read that book and review it as well. We talk the next podcast that we had that was somewhat similar to what we saw with David Libby was the podcast where I talked about the moral basis of condemning slavery. And what happens is you can often find atheists that condemn the Bible's regulation of slavery. And I basically said, what moral basis do you have for that? Now, part of this was inspired by the episode with Mark because he brought it up, and thinking that there was going to be some kind of a gotcha moment. And there's not, right? The regulation of slavery is similar to the regulation of divorce, where we see Jesus say, when he is questioned in Matthew chapter 19, he says, look, Moses gave you that regulation because of the hardness of your hearts. But from the beginning, God didn't want people getting divorced. So you have to see the difference between regulation and something that God wants to happen. Of course, God didn't want slavery to happen. There's literally a book of the Bible called Exodus where a group of people are freed from Egyptian slavery. Those are God's people. So the idea that God is for slavery is a ridiculous idea. And so we talked about that in that episode. And again, not well liked. 2 likes to 28 dislikes. And so again, by this point, I realized that again, often the more dislikes, the more traction and where people are really engaging with the video. So it's like, okay, well, that's just what it's going to be then. So we talked about we had more episodes now where I was regularly doing 2 or 3 episodes at a time of solos, and I talked to Drew Hall, who was a teacher, a public school teacher here in Alabama, and he talked about how God isn't afraid of your questions. There wasn't really anything controversial there. Again, it seems that the more controversial a guest is, that's where people seem to want to comment and watch and engage with the video. So we don't try to do that on purpose, but it seems that that's what's happened. We talked about estimating the Earth's age with the Bible, back to the book of Genesis. Then there were a couple of interesting interviews I had with Lance Hilsinger and with Jeff Rawls, each of whom wrote books. And these men do not, they would consider themselves believers, I think, and yet they don't believe that the Bible should be taken at face value. Particularly, Jeff Rawls wrote a book that God does not need your religion to exist, which is true. God doesn't need your religion, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't have a religion that he has developed himself and given to mankind. The book of James says that true religion and undefiled before God is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. So the scripture says that. So I can't turn around and say, well, any religion at all is not good, because if God says there's religion that's good, then we need to define things the way God does. So we see that that was an interesting episode with Jeff. Um, and then I had an interview with Robert Hausman about genetic engineering, and talking about playing God. And at that point, I was at a place where I think I had one other interview after this, and that was just at the turn of the year. And I really tried to double down moving forward on solo episodes. And at this point, I talked about how atheism and evolution disagree with Genesis 1 and science. And that was one that, again, uh, there was a lot of engagement with, but not a lot of likes. Uh, then I talked about 4 ways that evolution is religious and the Genesis accounts are scientific. Also, a lot of engagement, uh, not many likes. So again, we're not going to really talk anymore about really what the comments and the likes or dislikes are. You can look at those to the right if you'd like. I had an interesting episode where I uh, basically a little review of Wes Huff's interview um, on the Joe Rogan show, and where he talked to Joe Rogan about the Bible being accurate. So that was a really interesting episode. And then I also talked a little bit about um, cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor, and this was probably at that point my most viewed episode, because Alex O'Connor is that gave me a sense that this. I mean, I already had some sense that we were really attracting a lot of atheists to the channel. But that episode, where basically me talking about how Alex was wrong on a biblical issue. Alex essentially says that Jesus never claimed to be God in the Gospels, which is just patently false, and it's not that difficult to show. It's interesting. Alex also had a debate with David Wood a few weeks back, and about the same topic. And again, it's not that difficult to show this. And so what's very curious to me is someone like him, someone like a Christopher Hitchens, that will engage with and talk to people who are believers. Jordan Peterson is somewhat like this, where I wouldn't call him an atheist, but he is someone who is a huge evolutionist. It figures very heavily into his writings, and yet these guys are constantly around believers, it seems, and not as much around atheists and materialists as much. And I don't know what to do with that exactly, but maybe they're on a path towards belief. I don't know. But Alex O'Connor does a lot of stuff with people who are believers, and it's an interesting thing. It doesn't seem that he's just talking to atheists all the time. So and so it would seem to me that the reason why so many people were engaged with that video is that they recognized Alex on the thumbnail, and were but the topic is not about atheism. It's really about this idea from the Bible that Jesus claimed to be God. And so we basically just did a Bible study there and pointed out very clearly that of course Jesus claimed to be God on multiple occasions in multiple ways. Okay, so that took us to what, January of the year. And so my last interview that I've had is with Cassian Bellino. She is the host of Biblically Speaking. It's a podcast where she interviews what she would call experts on the Bible. And one of the things she talked about is that she just didn't get a lot of help wherever she was worshiping and studying the Bible, and that she's learned a lot more from just going and interviewing various scholars and preachers of different kinds. She's just learned a lot from that, and that's what her podcast is about. Just being able to be able to show there are really straightforward things that people who are believers ought to know that they often don't, and they're not learning in a church setting or in a Bible class setting. And that's what she sets out to try to remedy for herself, at least. What I would say is, again, a lot of those things that she was pointing out are not, I can't speak for other congregations and other Bible classes, but these are things that you go, yeah, yeah, that's pretty straightforward. um, and then I think there are things that there are some of the scholars that she will bring on that I would say, no, that's just not right. And we can show that in the Bible. So there are some things that you go, yeah, that's straightforward. But I think there are just a lot of churches that don't teach a lot of Bible. And so that's why she felt compelled to do that. So that was an episode from earlier this year. Um, and that was the point at which I said, I think I'm going to just focus on solo podcasts moving forward. And so that in itself was a pivot after January, that we moved towards just pure solo podcast. I just turn on the camera and I talk about a particular topic, or and even I began to use slides somewhere after this point. I don't think I'd gotten to slides yet, but the last several episodes I have been using slides. We talked about at this point, the pivot at the turn of the year was that I wanted to also include that third area of apologetics. So I've mentioned often that the first area of apologetics is related to the existence of God. The second area of apologetics is related to the inspiration of the Bible, and the third area of apologetics is related to the deity of Christ, that he is God. So this is what made the podcast uh, reviewing the comments of Alex O'Connor so relevant, because I was now including all three of those areas of apologetics in the podcast. But what I've found is the more I have poked at evolution, the existence of God, really that first area of apologetics, that has been where most people have engaged with the videos, and and it seems that we've gotten more comments and more engagement with that, and the other videos just largely weren't uh, being uh, either seen by people or just not pushed by the algorithm. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but we talked about God as a moral monster there in episode 34. Episode 35, we talked about evolution being monkey business. This was where one of the members of my congregation gave me this really old pamphlet where a preacher from 40 years ago, 50 years ago, was really very eloquently tearing down the evolutionary arguments. And the stuff from 50 years ago, for the most part, still holds up today from a science perspective, which was really interesting. And yet evolution has continued to gain ground and traction. I talked about the word Jesus in two different episodes. We talked about how Jesus, um, Christ, didn't just come into existence, uh, birthed to Mary, but that he is the co-eternal Son of. He is the co-eternal Word, and we see him in the Old Testament. So there were a couple of episodes about that. These were mostly Bible studies, and again, these are mostly about Jesus being deity. For the most part, that has not been something that people have taken as much interest in, and that's fine. We're trying to figure out how, how we can serve, how we can best help people and answer questions that people are interested in learning more about. And so we at the beginning of the year really wanted to go more into talking about again, never shying away from talking about Jesus, but again, it doesn't seem to be the content specifically that people are looking to have those specific questions answered. So I talked about what evidence would destroy my faith in God. I was asked that question by one of the elders of my congregation who had read my book, and I got to answer that question for that podcast, episode 38. We talked to. I examined a statement made by Penn Jillette about Christians hating atheists and unbelievers. I talked about the command by God to destroy genocide. These are, this is really a Bible study from 1 Samuel chapter 15. I talked about debating with a Jehovah's Witness in episode 41, I believe that is. And then episode 42 is an episode called Evolution is Bad Science. And this is where I reviewed an interview of Dr. James Tour with Dr. Rob Stadler. And that episode, uh, again, I haven't even tried to dig into the comments. It's 133 comments. And I barely have enough time each week to get the podcast done. And so any of the other stuff, I'm just not in a position to do. But that episode was an interesting one in terms of the engagement with it. And so up to 900 views. And so at that point, the most viewed of the podcast videos easily, but actually not the champion yet. We're going to look at that one from just a few weeks back. The next one I talked about, atheists being made in the image of God. Again, another Bible study. Those just don't seem to do as well. And again, when I say as well, I want to be clear that I don't mean I just want to get as many views as possible. But the difference between a video that 900 people are watching and a video that 25 people are watching, there's something to be said for. We do want to create content that is useful for people. So I would assume that the 900 view video is because we're talking about something that is engaging people and that people are wanting to learn more about. Otherwise, that just gives us a metric for that. So it's not so much about, again, wanting to monetize anything. We don't even care about that. But what ends up happening is after that atheist made in the image of God video, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I call BAE, which is Big Bang, Abiogenesis, and Evolution. And I came to this realization that as I was thinking about those three areas, is that there's often this claim that is made by people who are not believers, and they look at people who are believers and who do science or who mention God in connection with science, and they will say, "Well, you're just invoking the God of the gaps," and essentially they would say that you just come up with, if you don't know how something happened, you just say God did it. And there are times where people do that, and if they do, then I'm all for saying, well, hold on, we don't need to just simply say God did it for everything. But what was really interesting is that I realized that those three explanations are literally gods of the gaps. And what I mean by it is this: we see a universe that works. We see these planets that they go in these elliptical orbits, and of course the universe is able to have life in it. That's where we live. And so we see this solar system that if you made a model of it, it would just be this really cool structure. And we talked a little bit about, in the Evolution is Monkey Business podcast, we talked about how there was this anecdote from the life of Benjamin Franklin where he made a model of the solar system, I believe, and he was talking to an atheist, and the atheist said, where did that come from? Who made this? And Ben Franklin said, well, nobody made it. And the atheist said, well, of course somebody made it. He said, well, hold on. This is a model of the solar system, and you're positive that someone made it, but you don't want to say someone made the solar system. And so this is precisely what happens. You have a solar system that is clearly a system, and it has a certain structure, and it works in predictable ways. And yet the unbeliever, the atheist, the materialist has to account for this and not use God. So there's a clear gap. You have something that has been made, and it works in this very clock-like way. It works with precise timing and everything. But the atheist begins with the assumption that God cannot have anything to do with this. So now you have a gap. So you need something to fill the gap. You have a system, but there must not be a designer of the system. So you need something to fill the gap. And the thing that fills the gap at this point is called the Big Bang hypothesis. Now you can believe in a system without a designer because of the Big Bang hypothesis. It's the God of the gap. We see life exist on the earth. The law of biogenesis tells us that life comes from life, that life never comes from non-life. That's what the law of biogenesis says. But the atheist or the materialist cannot account for the existence of life from lifeless matter. How do you get from lifeless matter, non-life, to life? You believe that that's what happened. How do you get across the gap? You come up with these hypotheses regarding abiogenesis, that somehow actually life can come from non-life. It's the God of the gap. There's a gap between non-life and life. You insert abiogenesis. There's a gap between an ordered universe and nothingness, Big Bang. And then finally, you have some single-celled organism, this life that popped up, this very simple biological life that popped up. And from that simple biological life, you have a vast, just diverse biological, ecological set of animals on the earth and plants and everything. And all of that came from one cell that somehow popped into existence from abiogenesis. How do you go from that single-celled organism to all of these multicellular and multi-organ and multi-system animals and plants in the world? You have this huge gap from simple life to complex life. You got to fill the gap because it can't be God. God cannot have designed this. So what do you use to fill the gap? Evolution. These are gods of the gaps. They literally are gaps because they will not abide or allow for the existence of a designer to make these things. You see, when we argue from design, we're not arguing from a gap. We see design, just like the atheist sees the design of that model of the solar system. We look at the solar system, we look at the human body, we look at systems in nature, and we say systems require designers. That's not a gap. That's just an observation. But these people, by removing God, create gaps that they now must fill. And they fill them with Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution. These are gods of the gaps. Now, that's what I point out in this was episode 44. And so far, it's gotten like 1,100 views. And so it was easily, two of my biggest videos are basically both from the month of April, which was really interesting. And so it became clear that more of that kind of content seems to be what is engaging people. And so we will probably be doing more of that. Sometimes you kind of get tired of ragging on evolution. It seems like low hanging fruit. Honestly, it's very easy. It's like, it's so clearly false. And yet when you point out something like evolution being gods of the gap and abiogenesis and Big Bang being gods of the gaps, it seems to be something that's engaging people. So we'll continue to do that. I felt really good about episode 45, but people didn't seem to feel the same way, so that's fine. And then last week, the Mother Nature or Father God episode. So what I'm saying is, I think what will probably happen. We've always increasingly over the history of this entire podcast, the evolution of this podcast has been, and again, I use that word intentionally. Things change for the better when you apply your intelligence, ingenuity, intellect, when you apply energy, when you apply effort, then you do get changes for the better in something. And so I would like to think that when you look at my thumbnails, look at my thumbnail for this episode that has like this Mother Nature versus Father God and has me right there, episode 46. If you go back and look at my episode from episode 1, or my thumbnail from episode 1. Let me show you my thumbnail from episode 1. It's me and it's a picture of, it's like a black and white picture of me and Moise, and then Moise is, I didn't even get a great picture. That's my fault, not even getting a good picture of him. And so this is it. It's like a white background, black letters, and has Jerry Lee PhD and episode 1, and puts the person's name there. Like that's my thumbnail from back in um, what was that, June 21st, 2024. That's where it was. And now, if we come to now, we got a color, we got the Faith Science logo. And so I hope that even a year from now, I'm going to look back and cringe at this one. Um, and so we're trying to make little changes for the better. So we started out interviewing educators and habit coaches and just various different people, and we kind of went away from interview style to more of solo podcast. We still might do interviews, but now we're going to be doing some book reviews. We're going to be doing and then we're going to probably be doing fewer of the episodes where you're kind of doing, it's not, I have nothing, I don't have no problem with doing a Bible study here and there, but it seems that people are, the specific area that people are looking for more information about is when I'm talking about the science behind and the approach to looking at these ideas like Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution, and showing that they are anti-scientific, showing that they are gods of the gaps. These kinds of, when you're pointing that out and saying that evolution, from episode 42, evolution is bad science, this is something that people are engaging with and saying, wait, is that true? And maybe people are saying no, it's not, and they're just rage watching or something. I don't know, but it seems that people are again are going to be more interested in that than not. They don't really want to know if atheists are made in the image of God or not, right? Like that's not what people are seeming to be engaging with. So we want to try to help where possible. So there's going to be more content related to evolution versus intelligent design. That's just we're going to be, and I'm going to be attempting to dig more deeply into that, still keeping it on the level, not going into like graduate school level talk about it, but also giving more evidence than potentially I was in the past, because right now I've kept it mostly surface level and not digging too deeply into it. Sometimes I'll have people come to me and say, "Hey, I saw that podcast, and like I didn't understand what you were saying." And so I'm trying to avoid not doing that. So yeah, that gives us, takes you through the history from episode 1 to episode 46. And what we're going to be doing in the coming weeks is doing some book reviews with people who are maybe atheists, like related to like Christopher Hitchens, uh, or some of the stuff related to creation science, or um, what was the other stuff? David Libby's book, apologize without apologize without apologizing, and some of that stuff. So we'll have some of that, and then I'll be certainly doing some things related to the racism connected to, that I believe is inherent to evolution. And so some of that is in the pipeline as well. So just wanted to kind of do a review episode because we're making another pivot. And so we will be mostly in that first area of apologetics. I think at first I thought, okay, we're not even apologetics at all. Then the second, or the first major pivot was to go to two areas of apologetics. Earlier this year, we went to three areas of apologetics. I think moving forward, we're going to just narrow it down to one and really focus on the existence of God. And we'll be looking at some things from the Bible where it aligns with science, but we're going to be focusing primarily on the existence of God and the failure of evolution and evolutionary storytelling and narratives, uh, how that really doesn't line up with what we observe and what we see in science. And so that's going to be the direction we're going into next. And so will likely pivot again down the road, but that's where we're going next. And so just wanted to kind of give you a heads up about that. And so you can expect to see a lot more design versus evolution type of content. And so if you are if you want to give me any feedback about this, then the way to get in contact with me is at the email address that you can contact me regarding this is Jerry, Jerry, at jerryswafford.com. So JerrySwafford.com. So Jerry at jerryswafford.com. You can contact me there, and with any suggestions or questions or anything about the podcast, you can contact me there. So that's it for today's show. Just kind of a review show of the last few weeks and kind of give you a sense that we're going to really lean more heavily into some of the content you've seen over the last few weeks. We're going to be going more in that direction. So if you're expecting more of Bible studies and or some of those other things, it doesn't mean we won't ever do any Bible studies again. Or it doesn't mean that we won't ever do do interviews anymore, but for right now we're going to lean more heavily into the solo podcast format and really look at improving that and really getting the information out here regarding the anti-scientific nature of some of these ideas behind evolution, Big Bang, abiogenesis, and showing how when you look at something like creation, how much that actually does line up with the evidence that we see. To the and again, this is not what you're going to be told. This is not what you're going to see in your science textbooks, but we're going to really try to we are going to break down why that's the case and give you, those of you who are believers who are watching, and some of you are subscribing. I'm seeing more and more people subscribing, so I really appreciate that. We're going to give you information that can help you show people why what we see in the Bible can be trusted and how the world lines up with what we see in the scripture rather than the other way around. So that's it for today's show. Till next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith.